This story chilled us to the bone when we first received it. It was sent in by one of our subscribers, who asked us to share their experience. What you're about to hear is a first-hand account of a terrifying discovery that has left a lasting mark on an entire family. This isn't a tale of ghosts or legends. It's a real-life experience, one that will leave you questioning what truly exists in the places we call home. I've always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, tales of the supernatural. They were fun to hear, sure, but they never felt real to me. My family has always been the same way. Grounded, practical, and uninterested in the bizarre. That's why, when I tell you this story, I want you to know I don't take it lightly. What happened in my house wasn't the product of overactive imaginations or family folklore. It was something we all experienced, and to this day, none of us can fully explain it. We moved into the house when I was 9 years old. It was an older home, built sometime in the 1920s, but it had been renovated a few times over the decades. It wasn't perfect. The floors creaked, the walls had cracks here and there, but it had a charm to it. My parents called it character. I just called it home. The house wasn't particularly big, but it felt cozy. It had a spacious living room, a small but functional kitchen, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. My room faced the backyard, and I liked to sit by the window and watch the trees sway in the wind. For years, nothing about the house seemed unusual, though sometimes I'd get this strange feeling when I was alone. You know that sensation, like someone is standing just behind you? It wasn't strong, just a flicker of discomfort that I chalked up to an overactive imagination. My parents loved the house, though they always joked that it had its quirks. The basement door would swing open on its own if it wasn't latched properly, and the upstairs hallway always felt drafty, even in the middle of summer. We'd laugh about it. Old house problems, my dad would say. But looking back, there were signs. Little things that didn't seem important at the time, but now feel impossible to ignore. Like how the family dog refused to go upstairs, even though we never heard or saw anything strange up there. Or how, every now and then, I'd hear faint tapping sounds at night, which my parents said were just the pipes settling. For almost 10 years, we lived in that house without any major issues. It was our home, and we were happy there. Then came the renovations. It started innocently enough. My dad wanted to repaint the upstairs hallway and fix a loose floorboard that creaked loudly whenever anyone walked on it. He said he wanted to modernize the place a bit. The project wasn't a big deal, just some paint, new nails, and elbow grease. I was helping my dad with the floorboard when we made the discovery that would change everything. We were prying up the loose board when we noticed something odd. Underneath the wooden plank was a hollow space, a gap between the floor and the ceiling of the room below. It wasn't unusual for old houses to have gaps like that, but what caught my attention was the sound the crowbar made when it tapped against the wood. It wasn't the dull thud I expected. It sounded hollow, almost like there was something behind it. "Dad, listen to this," I said, tapping again. My dad frowned and crouched down beside me. "That's weird," he muttered. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the gap. At first, we didn't see anything, just the usual beams and insulation. But then the light caught something, an edge sharp and distinct, that didn't belong. "Is that a wall?" I asked. He didn't answer, but I could see his curiosity growing. We carefully removed more of the floorboards, revealing a hidden panel. It was flush with the other walls, painted the same neutral color, and looked like it had been deliberately concealed. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied, his voice tinged with excitement. "But we're going to find out." At that moment, I felt a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. Something about the panel didn't feel right. It wasn't just the fact that it had been hidden. It was the way it seemed to blend in so perfectly, as though it wasn't meant to be found. My dad, however, was determined to investigate. He grabbed a screwdriver and began prying at the edges of the panel. It took a while, but eventually, it popped loose, revealing something none of us expected: a narrow, pitch-black space behind the wall. It was the first time I'd felt real fear in that house. Not the jumpy, adrenaline-fueled kind of fear, but a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. "Looks like we've got a mystery on our hands," my dad said with a grin, his voice cutting through the tension. But it didn't feel like a mystery. It felt like a warning. My dad had always loved a good project, and this seemed to intrigue him more than anything else we'd uncovered during our time in the house. But while he saw it as an exciting challenge, I couldn't shake the unease I felt staring into that dark, narrow space. "Grab the flashlight," he said, motioning for me to shine the beam inside. At first, all I could see was empty darkness. Then, as I adjusted the angle of the light, the beam revealed the outline of a small, tightly shut door. It looked old, the wood rough and uneven, like it had been put there decades ago and forgotten. "Now, that's interesting," Dad said, leaning in for a closer look. The door didn't have a knob or handle, just a small indentation where you could wedge your fingers in to pull it open. For a moment, neither of us moved, staring at the hidden door as though it might do something on its own. "Should we open it?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "Of course," my dad said with a confidence I didn't feel. He grabbed a pry bar and wedged it into the gap. With a sharp groan of protest, the door gave way, revealing a passage leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up from the opening was cool and damp, carrying with it a faint, musty smell. It wasn't overpowering, but there was something oddly unpleasant about it, almost like the scent of something long forgotten. My dad shone the flashlight down the passage, revealing a narrow set of stairs made of old, uneven wood. They creaked ominously as he tested the first step. "Stay here," he said, a note of caution creeping into his voice. I wasn't about to argue. I watched as he descended slowly, the flashlight's beam bobbing up and down as he made his way into the space below. "It's a room," he called up after a few moments. "Looks like it hasn't been touched in years." Against my better judgment, I crept down the stairs after him. The room wasn't large, maybe 10 by 10 feet, but it felt suffocating. The walls were bare, made of cracked plaster, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its cord swinging slightly, but there was no switch in sight. The room was sparsely furnished. In one corner, there was a chair facing the wall, as though someone had sat there staring at nothing. A desk sat against the opposite wall, its surface bare except for a small, square object that I couldn't quite make out. "What do you think this was?" I asked, my voice echoing faintly in the enclosed space. "I have no idea," Dad said, "but someone went to a lot of trouble to hide it." We spent a few more minutes looking around, but there wasn't much to see, at least not at first. Then I approached the desk and got a closer look at the object sitting on it. It was a small music box, intricately carved and oddly beautiful. "Look at this," I said, holding it up to the light. The box had a crank on the side, but when I turned it, nothing happened. It seemed broken, or maybe just old. There were other strange items scattered throughout the room, though most were too degraded to recognize. Faded scraps of paper, pieces of broken glass, and an old photograph lying face down on the floor. When I picked up the photograph, I felt a sudden chill. The image was faded, almost completely worn away, but it showed a group of people standing in front of a house. The house looked just like ours. "Dad, look at this," I said, holding the photo out to him. He frowned, taking it from me. "Ah, must be the original owners," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We decided not to spend too much longer in the room. The air felt heavier the longer we stayed, and there was something about the way the shadows clung to the walls that made me uneasy. "We'll come back later," Dad said, his tone brisk. He shut the hidden door behind us and secured the panel back in place. But even after we left, I couldn't stop thinking about that room, about the chair, the photograph, and the music box that refused to play. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't explain why. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something faint and melodic drifting through the house. It was so soft I almost didn't notice it, a quiet, tinkling tune that seemed to come from far away. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. For the next few days, my dad and I didn't say much about the hidden room. He was busy patching up the loose floorboards, and I was trying to focus on schoolwork, though my mind kept wandering back to what we'd found. I think we both wanted to act like it wasn't a big deal, that it was just another oddity in an old house. But deep down, I knew we weren't done with that room. The music box, in particular, lingered in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it looked so carefully crafted, almost delicate, and yet utterly lifeless. Something about its silence made it feel like it was holding back, like it wasn't broken, but waiting. On the third night after we discovered the room, I couldn't sleep. The air in the house felt different, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. And then I heard it again, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of music. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The melody was distant, but I was certain it was the same one from the music box. It wasn't coming from my room. It seemed to be drifting up from somewhere below. The logical part of me wanted to stay in bed and ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, careful not to wake my parents. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes even the smallest sounds feel deafening. When I reached the first floor, the music stopped. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The hidden door was just a few feet away, and the thought of opening it made my skin crawl. But something compelled me forward. I pressed my ear to the panel, listening. Nothing. I waited for a few minutes, tried to convince myself to turn around and go back to bed. But then I noticed something odd. The air near the panel was cooler, almost icy, like a faint draft was seeping through the cracks. It didn't make sense. The room below was sealed, and there were no windows or vents leading to it. Before I could second-guess myself, I pried open the panel and shone my flashlight into the passage. The stairs leading down looked exactly as we'd left them, covered in dust and cobwebs. But the light caught something at the bottom, something that hadn't been there before. The chair. It was no longer facing the wall. It had been turned around, now pointed directly at the stairs, as though someone or something had been waiting for me to return. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea. I wanted to slam the panel shut and run back to my room, but my feet refused to move. "Hello," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Against every instinct, I stepped onto the stairs. They creaked loudly under my weight, the sound echoing in the confined space. With each step, the air grew colder, and the beam of my flashlight seemed weaker, barely cutting through the shadows. When I reached the bottom, I saw that the chair wasn't the only thing that had changed. The music box was no longer on the desk. It had been moved to the chair, its crank now facing upward as if inviting me to turn it. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached out. The box felt colder than I expected, the wood smooth and polished despite the thick dust coating everything else in the room. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the crank. Then, almost without thinking, I turned it. The box let out a sharp click, and for a moment, I thought it was broken. But then the melody began, slow and haunting, filling the room with a sound that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. As the tune played, I noticed something on the wall opposite me. At first, it looked like just another shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was moving. The outline was faint, barely more than a ripple in the air, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow didn't have a clear shape. It was amorphous, shifting and pulsing like smoke trapped in water. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was looking at me. The music stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. That's when I heard the faintest whisper, so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Leave." I dropped the music box and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stairs in my rush to get out of the room. By the time I reached the top, my chest was heaving, and my hands were slick with sweat. I slammed the panel shut and leaned against the wall, trying to calm down. I wanted to wake my parents, but what would I even say? That I'd heard a voice? That I'd seen a shadow that didn't make sense? They'd think I was losing it. Instead, I crept back to my room, my mind racing. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I told myself I wouldn't go back to the room again. Whatever was down there, it didn't want us there. But deep down, I knew it wasn't finished with us yet. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that what had happened in the room was a dream, or at least some trick of my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself as I got ready for the day. But the feeling of unease lingered. My dad didn't mention the room at all during breakfast. He was back to being his usual self, focused on work emails and asking me about school. I wondered if he'd had any strange experiences since we'd uncovered the hidden door, but I didn't dare ask. It felt like bringing it up might somehow invite it back. It wasn't until later that day, when my mom asked me to help clean the living room, that I found it, the journal. I was dusting the coffee table when I noticed the corner of a small, leather-bound notebook sticking out from under the couch. It was old, the leather cracked and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I frowned, holding it up. "What's this?" My mom glanced over. "Where did you find that?" "Under the couch," I said. She shrugged. "Probably something your dad found in that secret room of his. He's been bringing stuff upstairs and leaving it all over the place. Can you put it with the rest of the junk he found?" I nodded, but instead of putting the journal with the other items from the hidden room, I opened it. The handwriting inside was cramped and uneven, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. The first page was dated April 14th, 1953. The words were faded, but still legible. "They don't know I'm here. They never come down anymore. It's just me and the shadows now." My stomach tightened as I read the words, my heart beating faster with each line. "Sometimes I think they're watching me. Not the people upstairs, they don't care, but the ones behind the walls. I hear them at night, whispering. They want me to join them. I won't." I turned the page, but the next entry wasn't dated. It was written in a shakier hand, the words almost illegible in places. They told me the room wasn't on the plans, that it was built before the house. But I know they're lying. It was always here, and it will always be here. I see them in the mirror now, watching. My hands were trembling by the time I flipped to the next entry. The handwriting was even more erratic, with whole sentences crossed out or scribbled over. "It won't let me leave. I tried, but the door won't open. They don't hear me shouting. I think they're happy I'm gone. The shadows are closer now. They're inside the walls." I slammed the journal shut, unable to read anymore. The words were too strange, too close to what I'd felt in the room. At first, I thought about showing the journal to my parents, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear that they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I just didn't want to drag them into it. Instead, I stuffed the journal into my backpack and tried to forget about it. That night, I heard the music box again. The sound was louder this time, no longer distant. It was unmistakable, drifting through the house like it was searching for someone. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. When the music stopped, I thought it was over. But then I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone was knocking on a door deep inside the house. I buried my head under the covers and prayed for morning. The next day, I couldn't resist the pull of the journal. I opened it during lunch, flipping through the remaining pages. Most of them were blank, but near the end, there was one final entry, written in a shaky, almost childlike scrawl. "It's not the room. It's what's in it. It's part of the house now. It's part of me." That was it. The writing stopped there, the rest of the journal empty. I wanted to believe it was just some crazy story, something left behind by the previous owners to mess with anyone who found it. But the way the words mirrored what I'd seen, the chair, the shadows, the feeling that the room was alive, made it impossible to dismiss. That evening, I overheard my dad talking to my mom about sealing the hidden room back up. "It's not worth keeping it open," he said. "It's just an old storage space. Better to patch it up and forget about it." But something told me the room wouldn't let us forget. After my dad mentioned sealing up the room, the atmosphere in the house began to change. At first, it was subtle, small things that could easily be explained away, though they still made my skin crawl. For example, I'd leave my backpack in one spot and find it somewhere else, unzipped, with the journal sticking out like someone had been reading it. My dad dismissed it as my own forgetfulness, but I knew where I'd left it. Then there were the sounds. They started as faint creaks and groans, the kind you'd expect from an old house. But over the next few nights, the noises grew more distinct. The tapping I'd heard before was back, this time louder and more deliberate. It seemed to move through the house, first in the living room, then near the stairs, and finally outside my bedroom door. One night, I thought I heard whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading, like someone desperately trying to get my attention. I wasn't the only one who noticed the changes. My mom mentioned that the lights flickered more often, even though we'd recently replaced the bulbs. She said the kitchen clock stopped working, no matter how many times she replaced the batteries. "Must be a wiring issue," my dad said. but his voice lacked conviction. The disturbances escalated about a week after we found the room. It started with small objects going missing: keys, a mug, my dad's wristwatch. They'd turn up in strange places, like inside kitchen cabinets or tucked under the couch cushions. One afternoon, my mom was cleaning and found the music box sitting on the coffee table in the living room. "I thought this was downstairs," she said, frowning as she turned it over in her hands. "It was," I said. I didn't tell her I'd last seen it on the chair in the hidden room. "Maybe your dad brought it up," she said, setting it aside. But when I asked him later, he denied touching it. That night, the music box played again. This time, it was louder than ever before, the haunting melody filling the entire house. It started and stopped intermittently, as if someone were cranking it in bursts. I crept out of my room, determined to find the source. The music seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the walls. My parents' bedroom door opened, and my mom peeked out, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. We stood frozen in the hallway, listening. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the house in silence, so complete it was almost deafening. After the previous night, I didn't need to convince myself that something was wrong. The sounds, the shifting objects, the whispers, it was all too real. I wasn't the only one who felt it. When we sat down for breakfast, the tension in the air was palpable. My dad looked more serious than I'd ever seen him. His usual lighthearted demeanor was gone, replaced by something colder, more resolute. "We're sealing up that room today," he said, his voice firm. My mom nodded quickly, glancing at me. "Whatever's going on, it stops now. We'll cover the panel and forget about it." For the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of relief. My dad was the kind of person who got things done, and I believed him when he said he'd seal the room. But things didn't go as planned. My dad gathered his tools after breakfast and headed to the hidden door. I followed him, standing just outside the hallway as he crouched to remove the panel. The moment he pried it open, a cold draft swept through the hallway, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My dad hesitated, frowning. "Where is that coming from?" he muttered. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. It was the same smell I'd noticed in the room before, but stronger now. "Let's get this over with," my dad said, shaking his head. But as he tried to measure and fit the materials he'd brought to cover the door, things started going wrong. Tools slipped out of his hands, screws fell and rolled under the floorboards, and the measurements never seemed to line up correctly. "What's the problem?" my mom asked, coming over to check on him. "I don't know," my dad said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Nothing's fitting right." He stepped back, muttering something about needing different tools, and headed to the garage. While he was gone, I stayed near the door, unable to look away. The cold draft had stopped, but the air still felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. When my dad returned, he tried again, but no matter what he did, the materials wouldn't fit. Every piece of wood he cut seemed just slightly off, and the nails bent or broke whenever he tried to hammer them in. "Maybe we should call someone," my mom suggested. "A professional." "No," my dad interrupted. "I can handle it." He worked for hours, but by late afternoon, he was forced to admit defeat. "We'll try again tomorrow," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. That night, the disturbances escalated. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the tapping started again. It was louder now, more deliberate, like someone knocking on a door just beneath the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was rhythmic, almost mechanical, but it sent a chill through me all the same. Then the music box began to play. The melody was louder this time, filling the house with its haunting tune. My parents must have heard it too, because their bedroom door creaked open, and I saw my mom step into the hallway. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. We both stood frozen, listening. The music stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the house was silent. But then came the footsteps. They were soft, almost hesitant, moving through the house like someone was searching for something, or someone. My dad appeared in the hallway, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the flashlight he kept by the bed. I wanted to stop him, but the words caught in my throat. I watched as he descended the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. My mom and I stayed at the top of the staircase, holding our breath as we listened. "Nothing down here," My dad called after a few minutes. He sounded calm, but when he came back upstairs, his hands were trembling. "Let's just get some sleep," he said, avoiding our eyes. But none of us slept that night. The next morning, my dad tried again to seal the room. This time, he brought different tools, determined to get the job done. "It's just a door," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I stood back as he worked, watching as he measured, cut, and hammered. For a while, it seemed like he was making progress. The panel was nearly sealed, and my dad started nailing in the final piece. But then the hammer slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. "What the?" he muttered, reaching for it. As he did, the panel popped open, the door beneath it swinging wide as though it had been forced. A chill ran through the hallway, and my dad stumbled back, staring at the open passage. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking. He grabbed the panel and slammed it shut, leaving the tools scattered on the floor. "We're done with this," he said to my mom. "We'll call someone tomorrow. Professionals, a contractor, whatever it takes." But something told me the room wasn't going to let us go so easily. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps again. They were slower this time, heavier, as though whatever was making them was growing more confident. The air in my room felt colder, and when I looked toward the door, I thought I saw something move, just a faint shadow, shifting against the wall. I stayed frozen in bed until the first light of dawn crept through my window. After another sleepless night, my dad finally called a contractor. He didn't go into detail about the room, just said we discovered a hidden storage area and needed it sealed up. The contractor promised to come by the next morning. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. But deep down, I knew the room wasn't going to let us seal it so easily. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows stretched across the house, I found myself drawn to the hidden door again. I knew I shouldn't go near it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but I couldn't help myself. The house was quiet. My mom was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, and my dad was in the garage, sorting through his tools. I crept down the hallway and knelt in front of the panel. The air felt colder here, and as I pressed my ear to the wood, I thought I could hear something faint, a whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. I hesitated for a moment before prying the panel loose. The hidden door stood slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. My flashlight flickered as I descended the stairs, the beam casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The smell was stronger now, sweet and rotten, like flowers left to decay in stagnant water. The chair was still in the middle of the room, but it had been moved again. This time, it faced the desk where the music box sat. Something else was on the desk now, something I hadn't noticed before. A small, folded piece of paper. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The paper was yellowed with age, and when I picked it up, it felt brittle, as though it might crumble in my hands. Unfolding it, I saw a crude drawing of a house. My house. The outline was shaky, as if drawn by a child, but the details were unmistakable. The slanted roof, the small porch, the single tree in the front yard. But there was something else. In the middle of the house, marked with a large X, was the location of the hidden room. I stared at the drawing, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Beneath the house, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words. "It is watching." The shadows in the room seemed to shift as I stood there, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I turned to leave, but as I did, the music box began to play. I froze. The melody was slower now, almost mournful, each note stretching out as though the box itself were struggling to play. And then I felt it, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on me from every direction. I turned toward the far wall, and for a brief moment, I saw something. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a distortion, a ripple in the air, darker than the shadows around it. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me, its presence filling the room. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. My flashlight flickered again, and when the beam stabilized, the distortion was gone. The music box stopped abruptly, leaving the room in silence. I didn't dare stay any longer. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I bolted up the stairs and slammed the panel shut behind me. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was trying to tell me something, or maybe it was trying to keep me there. The drawing, the music box, the whispers, it all felt deliberate, like the room was alive and it wanted something from me. I tried to ignore it, but the pull was stronger than ever. Every time I walked past the hallway, I felt it, a magnetic force tugging at my thoughts, whispering my name. I started having vivid dreams about the room. In one, I saw myself sitting in the chair, staring at the blank wall. The shadows in the room shifted and twisted, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. In another, I dreamed of the music box. In the dream, I was cranking it over and over, but no music came out. Instead, the sound was replaced by a faint, hollow breathing. The worst dream came a few nights later. I dreamed I was trapped in the room, the door sealed shut behind me. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could hear the whispers growing louder, surrounding me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke up, my throat was raw, and my room was freezing cold, even though it was the middle of summer. The obsession wasn't just affecting me. My dad, usually the calmest person I knew, was growing increasingly frustrated. Every attempt he made to seal the room seemed to go wrong. The contractor who had promised to come never showed up, claiming an emergency had come up at the last minute. My mom was quieter than usual, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. She started double-checking the locks on the doors and windows every night, even though nothing had happened outside the house. We were all on edge, and the room was at the center of it. The tapping, the whispers, the shifting shadows, it was all building to something. And deep down, I was starting to realize that whatever was in that room didn't want to stay hidden anymore. The night after my dream, I finally told my parents everything. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. The whispers, the moving chair, the music box that seemed to play on its own. At first, they just stared at me, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "You're letting your imagination run wild," my dad said, though his voice wavered. "I know what I heard." I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "It's not just me. You've both felt it too. The cold air, the noises. Mom, you even said you've been hearing footsteps." My mom looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, she nodded. "He's right," she said quietly. "Something's wrong with this house." My dad let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. "We'll figure it out," he said, but I could tell he didn't know how. That night, things escalated. It wasn't just the tapping anymore. The entire house seemed to come alive. It started with the doors. The basement door, which had always been a little finicky, swung open with a loud creak, even though no one had touched it. My mom closed it, only for it to open again a few minutes later. Then came the lights. The bulbs in the hallway flickered erratically, casting strange, jagged shadows on the walls. My dad replaced the bulbs, muttering under his breath, but the flickering continued. And then, as we all sat in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, the music box started playing again. It wasn't faint this time. The sound was loud and clear, the melody cutting through the house like a knife. My mom gasped, clutching my dad's arm. "Where is it coming from?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said, standing up. We followed the sound to the hallway. The hidden door was slightly ajar, the music growing louder as we approached. My dad grabbed the panel and slammed it shut, the music cutting off abruptly. "Enough of this," he said, his voice trembling. "We're leaving this thing closed. No one is touching it again." But the room wasn't finished with us. Later that night, as we lay in our beds, I started hearing noises again. But this time, they weren't coming from the hidden room. The footsteps were upstairs. They were heavier now, deliberate and slow, moving from room to room. I listened, frozen, as they passed outside my bedroom door and headed toward my parents' room. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't just on one door. It was on all of them. My room, my parents' room, even the door to the bathroom. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room, flinging the door open. "They're here," I shouted, my voice shaking. My dad was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his face pale. My mom was huddled under the blankets, her eyes wide with fear. The knocking stopped as soon as I entered the room. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Get your things," my dad said suddenly. "We're leaving. Now." We scrambled to pack a few essentials, throwing clothes and valuables into bags as quickly as we could. The house seemed to resist us every step of the way. The lights flickered more violently, plunging us into darkness just as we tried to gather our things. The footsteps started again, echoing through the walls, though no one was there. As we tried to leave, the front door wouldn't budge. My dad pulled at it with all his strength, but it stayed stubbornly shut, as though something on the other side was holding it closed. "Back door," he said, grabbing my mom's hand. We ran to the kitchen, but the back door was the same, locked tight, even though the bolt was undone. "What is happening?" my mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. Before my dad could answer, the music box started playing again. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was coming from the living room. We turned to see the box sitting on the coffee table, its crank turning on its own. My dad stepped forward, grabbing the box and hurling it across the room. It hit the wall with a loud crash, and the music stopped instantly. In the silence that followed, the front door creaked open on its own. "Go," my dad said, his voice shaking. "Now." We ran to the car, our bags forgotten in the chaos. My dad fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As we pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't resist looking back at the house one last time. That's when I saw it. In one of the second-floor windows, a silhouette stood motionless, watching us. It wasn't my dad, my mom, or me. The shape was tall and thin, featureless, like a shadow given form. It didn't move or wave. It just stood there, silently watching as we drove away. When I blinked, it was gone. I didn't say anything to my parents. I wasn't sure they believed me, or if I even believed myself. We didn't go back into the house that day. After the incident with the silhouette, my dad drove us to a nearby motel, where we spent the night in uneasy silence. None of us slept much. My mom kept glancing at the door as if expecting something, or someone, to come through it, while my dad paced the room, muttering under his breath about what to do next. The next morning, we went back to the house, cautiously stepping inside as though it might lash out at us. At first glance, everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could after the night we'd had. The furniture was undisturbed, the lights worked, and the oppressive air we'd felt before seemed to have lifted. But the moment we walked into the hallway where the hidden door was, I knew something was wrong. The panel that my dad had nailed shut was wide open. My dad froze, staring at the open door as if trying to make sense of it. "I locked that," he said, his voice shaking. "I know you did," my mom whispered, gripping his arm. I stepped closer, peering down the narrow staircase. The air was colder than ever, and the familiar, faintly sweet smell of decay wafted up from below. But there was something else, something new. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. At the bottom of the stairs, the chair had been moved again. This time, it was positioned directly in the center of the room, facing the doorway, as if inviting us in. On the desk sat several new items that hadn't been there before: an old pocket watch, a tarnished mirror, and a crumpled piece of paper. The music box was there too, sitting in its usual spot on the desk, as if it had never been thrown across the living room. "Don't touch anything," my dad said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. But I couldn't help myself. The paper on the desk caught my eye. It was yellowed and fragile, but the writing on it was sharp and clear. "You shouldn't have opened the door." My heart pounded as I read the words. "Dad," I whispered, holding up the paper. He took one look at it and grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the stairs. "We're not staying here," he said. "But what about?" "Forget it," he snapped. "We're leaving. Now." As we rushed to gather our belongings, I noticed other small changes in the house. The strange, sweet smell seemed to linger in every room now, faint but unmistakable. Shadows moved unnaturally, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. My mom found one of her favorite necklaces, which she'd left in her jewelry box upstairs, sitting on the kitchen counter. My dad discovered his toolbox, which had been in the garage, lying open in the middle of the hallway. It felt like the room's influence was no longer confined to its hidden space. It was spreading, bleeding into the rest of the house. The final straw came when my mom went to retrieve some clothes from the laundry room. She opened the door and immediately screamed, stumbling back into the hallway. "What is it?" my dad shouted, running to her side. I peered into the room and felt my stomach drop. Written on the wall in faint, almost translucent script were the same words I'd seen on the paper. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The writing faded before our eyes, like smoke dissipating into the air. My dad didn't hesitate after that. He grabbed our bags and ushered us out of the house, his jaw set in grim determination. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back one last time, half expecting to see the silhouette in the window again. But the windows were empty, the house still and silent. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly free. The room had changed, but so had the house. It felt alive now, watching us leave with quiet, menacing intent. Even though we left the house, its presence seemed to cling to us. We stayed at a motel for the next few days while my dad tried to figure out what to do. Selling the house was an option, but he didn't want to explain why we'd left so abruptly. "We'll go back to pack the rest of our things," he said one morning, his voice firm. "Then we're done with it. We'll hire movers, sell it as is, and never look back." My mom and I didn't argue. None of us wanted to return, but we didn't have much of a choice. When we arrived at the house, it was late afternoon. The sky was overcast, casting long shadows across the yard. I stayed close to my mom as we stepped inside, the air feeling heavier than ever. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It was stronger now, permeating every corner of the house. That faintly sweet, decaying scent clung to everything, making my stomach turn. The second thing was the silence. The house was unnaturally quiet, as though it were holding its breath. "We'll make this quick," my dad said, his voice tight. "Grab what you need, and we'll go." I followed him to my room, grabbing my backpack and a few other essentials. My mom stayed in the kitchen, packing dishes into a box. But as I was stuffing clothes into a bag, I heard something. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of rustling fabric. But as I stopped to listen, it grew louder. The music box. The melody was clear and haunting, each note ringing out as if calling us back to the hidden room. My dad appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded. "Stay here." I didn't listen. I followed him down the hallway, my heart pounding with every step. The music was coming from the hidden door, which was wide open again, revealing the dark passage below. "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Don't go down there." But he shook me off. "I have to see what's going on." Against my better judgment, I followed him. The air grew colder as we descended the stairs, the smell nearly overwhelming now. The music grew louder, filling the small room with its eerie tune. When we reached the bottom, I froze. The room had changed again. The desk was gone, as was the chair. The walls were bare, but they seemed to ripple, as though they were alive. In the center of the room sat the music box, its crank turning on its own. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark blur in the corner, barely visible against the dim light of the flashlight. But as my dad stepped closer, the shadow began to take form. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its shape was tall and angular, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, just a smooth expanse of darkness. My dad froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. What is that?" he whispered. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel it watching us. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to go." But he didn't respond. He seemed rooted to the spot, staring at the shadow as though he couldn't look away. The music box stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, I heard it again, the faintest whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. "Leave." I grabbed my dad's arm and yanked him toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't move, but then he stumbled after me, his grip tightening on my wrist. We ran up the stairs and slammed the panel shut behind us. The house seemed to shudder, as though it were alive, and the oppressive air lifted slightly. We didn't stay to pack anything else. My mom dropped the box of dishes and ran to the car as soon as she saw us burst into the hallway. "What happened?" she asked, panic in her voice. "Just go," my dad said, his voice hoarse. We didn't speak as we drove away, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. I couldn't bring myself to look back this time. We never returned. My dad sold the house to a property developer without ever going back inside. I don't know what they found when they renovated it, and frankly, I don't want to know. We never spoke much about that final visit to the house. My dad shut down any attempts to bring it up, and my mom seemed almost relieved to let the topic fade into silence. For a while, I tried to convince myself that we had truly left it behind, that whatever had been in that room was gone from our lives. But part of me knew better. After selling the house to a property developer, we moved to a smaller home in another town. It was newer, brighter, and completely devoid of the unsettling quirks that had plagued our old house. At first, everything felt normal. There were no strange noises, no cold drafts, no eerie shadows lurking in the corners. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. My parents seemed happier too. My mom filled the house with fresh flowers, and my dad threw himself into work, avoiding any mention of our old home. But the relief didn't last. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Every few weeks, one of us would hear a faint, tinkling melody. It was so soft, so fleeting, that at first we all dismissed it as imagination. The first time I heard it, I was alone in my room, doing homework. The music drifted through the air like a whisper, growing louder for just a moment before fading into silence. My chest tightened, and for a second, I was back in that hidden room, standing before the music box as its crank turned on its own. I ran to my mom, but she brushed it off. "You've been under a lot of stress," she said, though I could see the worry in her eyes. But then she heard it too. She was folding laundry one evening when she suddenly froze, her face going pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I strained my ears, but by the time I listened, the music was gone. She shook her head, muttering something about her imagination, but I knew it wasn't just her. The melody would always come when we were least expecting it, while my dad was fixing something in the garage, or while my mom was cooking dinner, or late at night when the house was completely still. It was never loud or intrusive, just a faint, haunting tune that seemed to come from nowhere. We never found its source, and it always disappeared before we could search for it. Although nothing else out of the ordinary happened in our new home, the memory of the house lingered like a shadow over our lives. My dad grew quieter, more withdrawn, as though he were carrying a weight he couldn't put down. My mom started sleeping with the bedroom door locked, even though there was no reason to. As for me, I couldn't stop dreaming about the room. In my dreams, it was always the same. The narrow staircase, the cold, heavy air, and the music box playing its lonely melody. Sometimes I would see the shadow again, standing silently in the corner, its featureless face watching me. Writing this story is my way of trying to make sense of what happened. I still don't understand what that room was or why it affected us the way it did. All I know is that we were never meant to find it. Even now, years later, I feel its presence. It's not in our new house, not really, but sometimes late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of the music box drifting through the air. It doesn't last long, just a few notes, but it's enough to remind me that some things don't stay buried. I don't know if the house is still standing, or if the developer tore it down like they said they would. Maybe the room is gone now, its secrets erased forever. Or maybe it's still there, waiting for someone else to stumble across it. I hope they don't. This story has left us deeply unsettled, and we want to thank the subscriber who had the courage to share it with us. If you've ever experienced something similar, a moment where your home or surroundings felt like they held secrets meant to stay hidden, we'd love to hear your story. Feel free to share it with us, but only if you're ready to confront it again. Until next time, remember, some mysteries are better left undiscovered. Stay safe and keep your lights on.